Fantastic. Okay, so this is teaching and making with primary sources. And I think first up to introduce themselves is Miriam.
Hi, everybody. I am Miriam Intrator. I am interim head of archives and special collections and digital initiatives and special collections librarian for rare books at Ohio University.
I'm Michele Jennings. I am the special collections instruction librarian and assistant professor at University of Dayton.
Hi, folks. My name is Blake Spitz, and I'm an archivist at UMass Amherst in Western Massachusetts.
Hi, I'm Greta Suitor. I'm the manuscripts archivist at Ohio University.
So just quickly, some context on how this presentation came about. I was formerly art librarian at Ohio University and worked with Greta and Miriam, and we proposed something this year. And then Blake kind of got added on, and we're excited to kind of talk about sort of projects that have happened, projects that are coming up, to give you some different perspectives on this idea of teaching and making with primary sources. So before we begin, I'll just talk you through what we're going to do today. The four of us are, again, going to be giving like a different perspective or an example based on our experiences. We will have time at the end for Q&A. We'll also be dropping a link to a Padlet in the chat for folks to add their own activities, questions, or comments. And please feel free to keep adding things to that Padlet throughout the session and beyond. We've added some of our own materials there to kind of get things rolling. So I'm first up. I will be kicking us off by first talking about why we're advocating for making with primary sources. And then there'll be kind of a discussion of some pedagogical tactics and perspectives that we can borrow from taking art and design education as a model. And of course, art and design is because this is one of the major places in the academy where teaching and making are sort of theorized and practiced. So why? Many of us probably have exercises in our toolkits as primary source instructors for working with primary sources, and especially visual ones as information like slow or deep looking activities, but extending the opportunities that we give students to respond to those items beyond writing or presenting also has a host of pedagogical opportunities. And before I expand on this, I'll just say a few things about how I come to this topic. Like I mentioned, I worked as an art librarian and liaison to studio art design, visual communication, and interior architecture for about 6 years before transitioning to a role where I teach in special collections and primarily a religious collection. So as an art liaison, working with Greta and Miriam, we're always trying to find opportunities to make with primary sources in order to draw in students working in these kinds of disciplines. And I've written and presented on the way that research happens and can be supported for art and design. And while I'll be sharing some of that work today, a lot of this has also been influenced by now having worked in this different setting and by teaching and making with primary sources in a domain where basically all of those ideas, teaching, making, and primary sources have this sort of like slightly adjusted definition. So just to get you started, in the literature written by artists about studio research practices, making is maybe predictably inextricable from knowing. And it's a way of reasoning through problems. That could be problems about the world, problems about materials, problems about form and space, and so on. And it also comes from interacting with primary sources or personal experiences, which can, of course, really can mean anything. And if you're curious about some of this literature, I do have a slide at the end that, has more things to read that we can add to the notes as well.
Michele, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the slides are not advancing, at least for me. So I just wanted to check with that.
Oh,
it's still on the why teaching. Oh, there we go.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm just talking a lot on this slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure. Sorry.
No, thank you. I'm almost done with this slide. I am a minimalist slide person. So anyway, making, whether it's purely for expressive purposes, for building a design portfolio, for sharing information with others, is deeply tied to the experiential learning cycle. And as we'll discuss in the next slide, making is not only a means of learning through hands-on experiences, but it also opens up opportunities for reflecting and responding to each other. And the other reason why you might choose to integrate making into your practice teaching with primary sources is the power of creativity and speculative thinking when interacting with the past and developing historical empathy. Using primary sources as a means of inquiry into the past or of imagining otherwise is integral in empowering students to think critically about them and to put themselves into the collection. And making offers us this maybe open-ended or low-stakes way of grappling with or just deepening their understanding of the world around them. And now, hopefully, the slide goes. Okay, so when thinking about how we incorporate teaching and learning strategies into teaching with primary sources, given my background, I thought it might be worthwhile to think about how it's taught in creative disciplines. So to do this, the concept that I turn to is signature pedagogies. This is a concept developed all the way back in 2005 by Lee Schulman, and it identifies the primary means by which future practitioners in a field are educated. And I think that this can tell us a lot about how knowledge is created and transmitted within that field. So in art and design, the most prominent signature pedagogy is critique. For those who don't know, critique is the sharing of in-process or completed works for verbal feedback from peers as well as experts, which could be the instructor or other invited guests. As an art librarian, it's not uncommon to be invited to crit to give feedback on how the work, maybe manifests some of what we have done in the library. Ideally, it does manifest that. And I should note that critique is not above critique. A poorly run crit can really be less of like a teaching strategy than like a tool of oppression or of silencing already marginalized students. And so for more on this, I really recommend the documentary, The Room of Silence, which I do have listed at the end here. So it may be that being invited to crit or running a really effective and supportive one is not where you're starting out, but there are still some things that we can borrow from crit. And in my research, I've explored how this also interacts with feminist and critical pedagogy. So the first is the balance of sustained solo work that is punctuated with opportunities for dialogue and community building through sharing our work. And in the era of active learning, it can feel sometimes counterproductive or like you're not really teaching when you place an emphasis on solo work in the classroom, but leaving room for students to problem solve and maybe reflect on what they're doing is one of the strengths of incorporating making into your teaching. And it's important here to take a process-based approach to the instruction. The final product isn't necessarily the point here, but that understanding and exploration that is gained through making. The other thing about this that's somewhat different from like a traditional think, pair, share model of active learning is that the onus of the discussion isn't entirely on the person who's presenting their work, but the person that's receiving it. And this does require a bit of vulnerability on both sides. So it's helpful to give ample warning to students that this is the plan for the day, and to set some community expectations, or even try to like kind of warm up both the creative impulses as well as the willingness to ask questions and offer impressions to one another. And to this point, another tactic or way of thinking about making as a pedagogical strategy for teaching with primary sources, especially outside of art and design disciplines, is that making is something that is practiced. And often folks that aren't accustomed to this way of learning or interacting with primary sources, since transitioning from being an art and design librarian to more of a multidisciplinary special collections teaching librarian, I've developed some like warm-up exercises and a habit of really trying to prime students for making through short mark making exercises. And for a definition of mark making, Here's a great one from the Tate in the UK, the Tate Modern or Tate Britain. Mark making describes the different lines, dots, marks, patterns, and textures we create in an artwork. It can be loose and gestural or controlled and neat. Mark making is often discussed in the context of early childhood development and art therapy. And it's a helpful starting place for helping students to understand the ways that making more generally can be an act of transmitting information about the world around them or their response to it. Writing is, of course, already a form of mark making. So ideally, drawing is like a helpful bridge between the work they maybe used to be doing in the classroom and starting to make. So I try goofy things like drawing an emoji to summarize our response to an object in special collections, or more traditional things in information literacy instruction, like concept mapping, but exploring different marks or gestures to convey the importance of or relationship between concepts. So a quick example to illustrate just some of these ideas is from a semester-long embedded class that I worked as a liaison for at my previous job with support from folks in special collections like Miriam and Greta, and the liaisons for music, theater, and dance. This was a capstone project for the newly formed Interdisciplinary Arts BFA at OU. And while the entire purpose of the library's involvement in the course was to support making and performing in an interdisciplinary space like the library, I want to focus on our session in archives and special collections. So one of the primary foci of the course was understanding artistic research practices. And for the section on artists and archives, we started with a discussion on the ways that artists typically interact with archives through speculative work, with historical materials, through personal archiving, by creating works that are meant to act archivally, and so on. And Greta walked students through accessing and understanding finding aids. And then we spent some time interacting with special collections materials pulled to complement some of the class's research interests. And luckily, the instructor had actually surveyed these in advance and sent them to us. So they ranged from gender and sexuality studies to textile and labor to, I think, aliens and nature and the outdoors and beyond. And it's important to note that as an interdisciplinary arts class, none of this particular cohort came from a visual arts background, but instead we're in the performing arts. So a lot of the work we were doing around making and mark making were perhaps not as familiar to them as had they been in my studio art classes. So just really quick, for this class, we adapted a worksheet that folks in archives and special collections typically use called See, Think, Wonder, which is like a deep looking exercise that encourages students to observe, surmise, and pose questions about an object in writing. And in our revised version, which you see here called Sketch, Speculate, Wonder, we swapped a written description of the items with a sketched one, with specific instructions to focus more on the sketch as a means of looking and understanding the item rather than creating a finished drawing. We then asked students to begin to consider how they might use this in their creative work and to, of course, identify what else they wanted to know about it. And I think what this activity demonstrates is that integrating making into your existing pedagogy might not require completely new lesson plans or a major overhaul, and that by starting with the basic ideas around teaching and making, there are some easy but intentional adjustments that you can make. And that's all I have. I take it back. There was one more slide, which is some sources. And there's a lot, but okay. Next up is Miriam.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the forms and processes that we at Ohio University have worked to put into place when it comes to some of the teaching for making that happens related to our collections and instruction. And I just want to check quickly because I had issues yesterday. Can you hear me? Okay, cool. So I also have to say that Michele, who you just heard from, was instrumental in creating a lot of these things that I'm going to be talking about today. Next slide, please. So first I'm going to give a bit of background, focusing first on the artist book collection. The Rare Book Collection has been collecting student-created artist books since the 1990s. During the semester, students come into archives and special collections for a session with a mix of student artist books from previous semesters and years, and artist books the library has purchased over time from creators not associated with the university. The library has a fairly robust history of collecting artist books, which we continue to this day. We seek to have a broad selection of structures, formats, materials, topics, and approaches, in part to help inspire students in their own making. After visiting and exploring the collection, students are assigned to make at least 2 copies of their own book, with the understanding that 1 copy will be added to the Rare Book Collection of student artist books. The image on the left shows a staff favorite, a book called Peanut Butter and Jelly, made out of ceramic tiles for the peanut butter, colored plastic wrap for the jelly, foam for the bread, and a good old brown paper lunch bag serving its actual function. Collecting these books has created a wonderfully diverse and eclectic archive of student creativity that we use in various tours and instruction sessions. However, as you can see in the image on the right, we are basically out of space to grow. Which brings me to pedagogical considerations, and to one in particular, which is that we want students to walk away with real, transferable skills for a potential future as a creator. But collecting every book is not true to life. Collection is a process of selection, a decision that takes certain items in while not acquiring the vast majority of other available materials. So to both contend with our space limitations and to provide students a more accurate experience with a collecting institution, we instituted a jury process where Michele and I attended the class's critique session, and from there selected up to 5 student books for the collection. Next slide, please. This is just another image of the extent of the collection and the lack of space for any additional boxes. So in the jury process, elements we considered included success of the structure, format, and materiality, inclusion of handmade or handcrafted elements, uniqueness of approach, voice, or execution, successful communication of a narrative, idea, or message, and overall quality and impact. Knowing their final books would be juried and carefully selected, we hope also helps motivate students through their process. Many are eager to become part of the collection, knowing that they or a family member could return years or even decades in the future to see the work they created as a student. This is not an uncommon occurrence and often has great meaning and impact. I will say that we only had the opportunity to really implement our jury process once. After that, the longtime professor of the course retired. The new person who came in worked very differently and not collaboratively, and then left the university for another position. So there's been an unfortunate vacuum in letterpress and bookmaking for some time, with books trickling in, but without us being able to establish any kind of communication or process to speak of. And I'll circle back to this at the end of my presentation. Next slide, please. Other learning for making student-created materials we often work with are zines and graphic design and typographic materials. A wide variety of classes in art and well outside of art are now assigning students to create zines. Pretty much all of them begin with a hands-on session with our zine collection for ideas and inspiration, and sometimes with other historic collections materials as well. As in pretty much all my examples today, the making itself does not happen in our space, but our space is central to the learning for the making. With zines, students are generally not required to make a copy to donate to the collection, but are given that option. Next slide, please. When they do opt to donate their zine, we have them complete this very simple zine donation form. This is important to ensure their understanding of and agreement to their zine being used in public and educational ways, which is not something that you can assume, as many zines are extremely personal and revealing. Next slide, please. On the left of this slide, you can see the catalog record for the zine pictured on the right, made by a class I worked with last fall. The entire class was about learning for making, and again, part of their inspiration and process included a visit to the Rare Book Collection. All the students made both artist books and zines, in addition to other materials, with the class also creating this collective zine that's now part of the collection. Next slide, please. The next example I'm turning to is a typography class from this past spring. Inspired in part by viewing typographical specimen books and artist books featuring typography and typographical experimentation from the rare book collection, each student was assigned to find, photograph, design, draw, create, or somehow construct each letter of the alphabet over the course of 9 weeks. The results of this assignment is a wide array of uniquely creative alphabets that you can see on this slide as posters on display outside archives and special collections. An exhibit was not part of the initial course plan, but the instructor and students were so thrilled and proud of the results of the project, as was I, that we agreed to find a place to hang them. The instructor and I worked together on placement of each poster and also hung a poster explaining the project and others with each student's artist statement. We also made the original digital files available via our blog, and we'll be moving the posters to a high traffic area near one of the library entrance doors for the fall semester. The class also held their final course in front of the posters. The student artist statements were also not part of the original assignment, but once we were going to hang them, I told the instructor that we needed some context, some information for each. What inspired the student? What was their process? We needed reflection and documentation of the who, how, and why. She agreed to ask them to complete this one additional assignment, which is not really a small task if you think about it, but pretty much all of them did it, to make the exhibit make sense. Next slide, please. This slide is just a quick example of the alphabet and the artist statement created by a student in the class who happened to also be a former intern with our digital initiatives department. Her referencing in the statement of a medieval initial and historic inspiration for her making stems also in part from her experience working with a wide variety of collections materials in the digitization studio. Next slide, please. I'm going to conclude with my current thinking about next steps when it comes to learning for making with primary sources. First is the good news that a new instructor has been hired to teach letterpress and bookmaking. I'm hoping to establish a strong connection from the outset and, if possible, create a more collaborative teaching process where students come to rare books for exposure to medieval manuscript material, books from the letterpress period, handpress period, as well as other important examples that illustrate the history and evolution of bookmaking, in addition to exploring our large collection of student and non-student artist books. As part of developing this new relationship, I also want to bring back the jury process for the student artist books. I want to formalize and refine it by creating a rubric to share with the instructor and students early in the semester to help guide them in their making, insofar as they will then have a clear understanding of what my selection decisions will be based on. This coming fall, I will also have a new intern working for course credit who will be processing our zine collection. We have several hundred zines and have reached the point where we need to come up with an organizational strategy for storing them. We also newly have archive space, and so she'll be creating a finding aid. Through all of this, she'll become even more familiar with the zine collection than I am, so she will be drafting recommendations for how we can better promote, teach with, and generally encourage increased usage of the zines. Finally, she'll be making recommendations with regards to growing the collection, with a particular focus on identifying students and other local and regional Appalachian Ohio creators. My final example is a bit different. Every year, I'm fortunate to have a graduate assistant from English. My GA from last year, who now works for the local public library, is immensely talented as a fiber and textile artist. Over the course of her assistantship, she began knitting, crocheting, and sewing items she was finding in some of the rare books. She conducted in-depth research on period dyes and materials to ensure her making was as temporally and materially authentic as possible. On this slide, you can see one of her inspiration books and a stack of some of the items she has made. This fall, she will curate an exhibit in the library that will include her handmade creations alongside the books, patterns, and stories that inspired them. I love how this bridges research, rare books, making, deep learning, exhibit curation, and writing. Plus, it extends beyond the bounds of the student's time at the university. I hope it will inspire other students in their own learning for making and in their own exploration of how archives and special collections can serve as inspiration for creative activity. Thank you.
Alrighty, so again, my name is Greta Suitor. I'm the manuscripts archivist at Ohio University. I'm going to be talking about a project we've been doing that utilizes digitized material from special collections and archives to create infographics. Next slide. For the last 3 years, myself, Miriam, and Michele all worked with the class 4112/5112 illustration capstone for advanced informational graphics. And over the course of those 3 years, students have created 18 posters for infographic projects using special collections and archives. Next slide. The infographics capstone class is held each spring and includes an assignment where students create infographics based on library collections. Part of the assignment is that they need to create something that could be in print form, digital form, it could be multi-platform. Usually it's digitally created and then printed out. A lot of them are text and image based, but they can include video or other elements or media. And the final product should be informational, but also to tell a story. And students work in small groups, so it's generally 2 to 4 students per project. As librarians, we're the clients, but we also are there to teach about the materials and offer research consultations. We review draft content and provide feedback during critiques. Next slide. For the assignment, students rely heavily on access to materials. They see them in person, but it's also critical that they have access to data about the collections and to images of collections. So we focus on collections of materials that we also have digitized and are in our, we use Content DM to provide access to those digital collections. So last spring, we worked with the Cornelius Ryan collection of World War II papers as it coincided with the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and material related to The Longest Day, which is a book Ryan wrote about D-Day. We have that all online. The digitized material mostly consists of surveys veterans completed. You can see here on the right side of the screen, we have an example of what those surveys look like. So students could incorporate those into their infographics, but also it kind of opens up the possibilities where they could also incorporate things, biographical information about Ryan, about his book. His book, The Longest Day, was also made into a movie. So we had materials relating to that. And then about D-Day itself. So they do use a variety of resources, not just what's in our collections, but it opens the door to kind of them thinking about how they can incorporate all these resources into one finished product. And we kind of base our collection selection on copyright status. We prefer things to be in the public domain or have clear copyright status. And then we want to just really focus on those digitized collections that we've put online. There's a lot of metadata with those collections. So we have tons of subject information, but also transcripts. So students, of course, had a hard time reading cursive. So like with the Civil War collection, it was really, really imperative that they have access to those transcripts as well. We want to use collections that have some kind of visual appeal, and these are often high interest and high use items. So seeing how students work with the collections, interpret collections, it just gives us so much insight into the collections, things that we hadn't thought about. Next slide. So this is an example of how we work with the class. We meet with the instructor the semester before. So we met in December. And during that meeting, we talked about the collection that we were interested in using, the Ryan collection, talked it through with the instructor, showed it to them online, and then kind of figured out our timeline during the course. So we actually met twice in the library for this class. The first time was really just an initial visit, to introduce students to the collection online and in person. So we had the physical materials there, and also I walked through Content DM, how you search. And then the professor gave an intro to the assignment during that class period and told them kind of what groups they would be working in. The next time the class came in, which was just the next week, they visited the library, and we split them into 2 groups. So with the Ryan collection, we actually have a dedicated Ryan room near the archives, and that is kind of a museum setup. There's display cases around the room. So we split the class in half. Half went to the Ryan room, got to see that, and the other half stayed and worked with materials and worked with their group and really figured out what they wanted to present in their infographics. And then a few weeks later in March, we attended the class in their normal classroom for final critiques. So that's when we can see how the students have changed their design and information over time. And we can give our final thoughts and reactions to their work. Next slide. Here's what the infographics look like. You can tell that some of them are from rare books. We have the illuminated manuscripts, and then at the bottom, there's the Margaret Armstrong publisher's bindings. And then we also have some that dealt with the Civil War. And then the one on the right is the one of the D-Day ones that was just made. And for that, they wanted to do a blanket infographic. That was part of the assignment. So each frame, for this one, there's 4 individual kind of posters. And when they all get together, they all have to create this larger image. So that was kind of a new twist on the assignment. It's always interesting to see how students interpret the collections, whether they're going to deal with the whole collection or if they're just going to focus in on one item. It really varies. Next slide. Here are students presenting their posters at the annual Student Expo. This gives them another chance to just bring their work to an audience and share what they've learned and share what they've worked on. Next slide. And then one of the groups actually won first place for visual communication category. So that was super exciting to see and hear about. So here they are with their winning poster. And you can kind of see they incorporated maps. We actually had a plane in the Ryan room. So they were kind of inspired by that to put that in the poster. And then they have a home in Athens, Ohio. So kind of commenting on why the collection is in Ohio. So yeah, just really, really great work and fascinating to see how the reception is of the posters. Next slide. And then after the Student Expo and the end of the semester, the professor brought the posters to us. And so we hung them outside of the Ryan room. And I'm really hoping this brings a little more noticeability to the Ryan room. This is kind of hidden in a corner. So hopefully this will get people to say, hey, what's going on over there, and bring them in. And so that's it for me. Thanks.
All right, hi folks. Can tell we're switching gears a little bit. Didn't get the slide template down. Coming to you not from Ohio in the past, but from nanotech land in Western Massachusetts. My name is Blake Spitz. I'm an archivist at UMass Amherst. And I'm going to be talking to you about something that has not happened, kind of switching gears a little bit more, thinking about maybe how you can get outside of the normal class format, or how do we find partners that want to do making with us, right, in relation to our stuff. So I'm going to be talking to you really briefly about a grant that I have had accepted with some colleagues, but nothing has happened about it yet. So some planning and how it came to be. And the grant title is here. It's entitled Archives, Art, and Activism. Black liberation and creation in Western Massachusetts and beyond. So next slide, please. So these are the two groups that are sort of being brought together in this opportunity. So I work in this library, big tower named after Du Bois, in the Robert S. Cox Special Collection, the University Archives Research Center. And this collaboration is coming together with a department or a unit within our School of Education called the Center of Racial Justice and Youth Engaged Research, or CRJ. Next button, please. And here you can see a little bit about what each of those units do. So in terms of SCUA, which is Special Collections University Archives, that's what we call ourselves. We do university archives collecting, documenting UMass, campus, which connects to documenting our School of Education and the units there, of course. And local collections, but our main thematic collecting area is documenting social change and social justice work, and have a real strength in collections related to racial justice work, sort of stemming from the Du Bois papers. And then the CRJ is working with youth, particularly youth of color and their teachers and the communities around those youth, to think about educational transformation and societal transformation, really. And has a bunch of different units where they have a youth board that advises them. They're in classrooms working with teachers, thinking about, healing, justice, and a lot of that is connected to racial justice. So next slide, please. Maybe you can start to see some of the connections here. And I apologize, I have a lot of text on my slides, which I usually do, but again, I have like no photos of what we've done because we haven't done anything. But how did I meet these folks? So on the left side here, the Black AF, the Black Artistic Freedom Conference, was a conference put on by the CRJ this past February. And I've been sort of itching to get to know some of the folks in this unit. I just think what they're doing and what they're interested in is interesting, period, is important, but also I think had some connections with our department and our mission. So I attended the conference and it was really fun, but introduced myself to some of the faculty and grad students that were running it. And I basically said, like, hey, I'm an archivist, I work in special collections. Part of our mission is to document university work. You are a university unit. Part of our mission is to document social justice work, especially racial justice work. You all are engaged in that work. We have amazing collections from the historical legacy of those movements, of Black liberation movement, of Black artist movements, of people engaging with changing some of these things based on their artwork and their design and their making. We work with classes. I'm an expert on archival theory, on our collections, on primary and source analysis. And you all, of course, are experts on teaching as well. You're in the School of Education, you work with teachers. You're approaching all of this with a critical lens. And you're having today here a conference that's all about artistic connections to freedom movements. So we should chat. That was sort of my pitch to them, and it went well. Everyone was sort of excited to meet each other, and we thought, like, someday we'll connect, we'll see what happens out of this. And then, like 2 days later, one of the faculty members reached out to me and said, hey, there's little pots of very internal, very little bits of money at UMass for faculty and other collaborators on campus, and said, we're going to apply for some of that. Do you want to do something? And I said, oh my goodness, let's get this done in 1 week. So next slide, please. And this one's really a lot of text, but I'll walk you through sort of what we applied for. So the UMass Office of Faculty and Development has some money for people on campus who want to do mutual mentoring. And so we applied like a week later after we all met in March. And this was the title of our proposal, which was Archives, Art, and Activism, Black Liberation and Creation in Western Massachusetts and Beyond. And so the mutual mentoring group is going to be formally me and 2 of the faculty from the CRJ, but I'm going to pull in some of my colleagues. We just hired a university archivist. Our visual archivist is going to be pulled into this, which she might be finding out right now in this presentation. And we're going to basically have a first moment where we're doing learning, which is these mentoring meetings. So like I can show them our collections that I think might be interesting to them and to their students. They're going to tell me how they're engaging with students, what their youth board thinks about this project. And then the bulk of the plan is to do this building phase, which is to, in their space, which is appropriate for making, bring either have students prior into our space or do it in their space with materials that are not our duplicates, is to have these archival maker spaces and to get these students and their teachers excited and inspired by our collections and then making art themselves. And the idea is to sort of, in the language of these education professors who are, grappling with language around the archives that's different than my own language, they're thinking like, this is going to be a living archive, right? We're going to have these students be inspired by the history that they're seeing and then make their own arts and letters in response. And as they dream about the future, as they dream about racial justice, and sort of see what comes together. And then lastly, the idea is to have some sort of public sharing of this work and some of these materials coming into the archive. So it's been interesting to hear from the first group about like, how do you take in student materials as a result of making engagements? And so, I think, again, what I encourage folks, even outside of our normal class model, and even if there's not sort of a grant connected to your work, is to think about other institutional entities at your space that might come together to use making as a way to demystify archival space and archival collections, or to think about taking your collections, from the past and the present into the present and the future, and to maybe even hit at some of not only your collecting mission, but some of your collecting gaps, and sort of expand the possibilities of what your materials are able to do, and in conversation. And that's all the hope. I don't know what's going to come of this. I think a lot of great things will come of it, but I don't know what the students are going to make or how we're going to frame that making. So I'm interested to hear from others, or can take questions on that a little bit. I think my last slide is just some thank yous, and some links to our department, the CRJ's department, and a couple other things. So we will get these slides, all of ours, up on that shared notes doc at the end. But I think that's it for me. And unless anyone has any closing, I think we'll stop the recording and move on to some of the questions that folks have. So thank you again.